All right. So the other day, I bought this 2000 Suzuki DRZ 400E off of Facebook Marketplace. I picked it up for $400. The lady had no idea what it was. She listed it as just Suzuki 250. It's not a 250. It is a 400, and clearly she didn't see the value in it. In reality, this bike's in very good condition for $400. There's a couple key components missing. The seat, the carburetor. We do have the carburetor, but it wasn't on the bike. And a couple other parts. The airbox boot is missing that connects the airbox to the carb. Other than that, it's really in good condition. We have most of the plastics here. We are missing the radiator shrouds. An FMF, I believe a real FMF exhaust on it. The tires both hold air, and they're both in pretty good condition. Very little dry rotting, and the knobs are still there. The brakes are both working. They're both in great condition. The radiator doesn't have any coolant in it, but the coolant system seems to be all there. The engine seems to turn over. I rode it down the hill, put it in gear, and let the clutch out, and it does have compression. So the goal for today is to try to get it started, and then we're going to get the parts that we need ordered and start putting this thing back together. And the goal is to flip this thing for a couple $1,000s at least and make some good profit off of it. So let's see what we can do. I figured a good first step in starting this thing would be getting it in the shop and examining it. One of the first things that I noticed is that the dipstick had 0 oil on it. Now, I don't know why Suzuki put the dipstick so far up on the bike, but something told me it wasn't reading accurately, so I wanted to pull the drain plugs off and see if any oil had collected in the bottom. And here you can see the dead leaves, grass, dirt, and grime from years of sitting and being abandoned, as well as the hardware, which thankfully wasn't stuck. Here I'm removing one of the drain plugs, and this is when the first red flag of this bike showed itself.
Oh my God.
So, yeah, I went to drain the oil, and this nasty, goopy sludge came out. There's some gray, metallic-looking stuff in there. So, hopefully that's not little transmission and motor particles in there. I'm really hoping not, because that would mean that there's some serious wear to the internals of this motor. Like I said, the bike did turn over pretty good, so nothing's locked up, which is a really good sign. This bike does have 2 oil drain plugs for whatever reason, so we're going to get the other one popped off and see if there's anything left in there. Yeah, that's rainwater. That is definitely rainwater. Rainwater and brand new oil. So, with the oil being in the condition that it is, I think what we're going to do is pour brand new oil up in here and leave both of these open and let the brand new oil kind of flush it out a little bit. And then we're going to let it sit wide open all night long and see if we can get as much of that gunk out as we possibly can. If it seems like all the gunk's out tomorrow, then we're going to top her off with oil and just hope that it works. Alright, so I've let the bike sit overnight, and it seems like all that gunk in there has worked its way out. Before putting new oil in it, I do really quickly want to pull and examine the oil filters and see if they need cleaned at all. Alright, so all in all, this oil filter is actually in pretty good condition. So we're just going to clean it up real quick and then throw it back in. Alright, so I sprayed some brake clean at an outward angle through this hole to try to knock some of that debris out. And then I also ran some pressurized air through it, so it should be a little bit more clean now. And I am eventually going to replace this with a brand new one. But first, I need to put brand new oil in the bike and then run the bike for a little bit and let the new oil work all the old oil out of the passages and then put a new one in, because if I put a new one in right now, it'll just get all the old oil ran through it and be ruined immediately. Alright, so the manual calls for 1.8 liters with the oil filter change, so that's what we're going to put in it. Alright, so I added 1.8 liters, and the dipstick still reads absolutely nothing, which is fine because the bike's meant to be run a little bit before it will show properly. Now, if you guys are wondering why I haven't just been cranking the bike to get the oil out, two things I forgot to mention. This bike's electric start only. It doesn't have a kickstart at all, unfortunately. And number two, it does have a keyed ignition, which I didn't have the key for. The lady, when she sold it to me, didn't know where the key was. So we're going to have to eventually replace that. But for now, we're going to have to find a way to bypass it. We're also going to have to run some current through the battery using the charger. With how long this bike's been sitting, I'm about 90% sure the battery's completely toast. But because we have the battery charger, as long as the starter itself is okay, we should be able to start cranking this bike pretty soon. Alright, so with the brand new oil in the bike, I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to focus on the carburetor. Now, the carburetor is a very important part of the motor, and it's also one of the biggest failure points. If it's mistuned or dirty, your engine's going to run horrible. So while it's off the bike, we're going to take it apart very briefly and run some carb cleaner through it and just clean out all the jets, making sure everything's nice on it. Whoever tried to take this carburetor off last definitely stripped a couple of the really important bolts. To be fair, they're very easy to strip. They're poorly designed. Oof, that is not good. Alright, so I pulled the top of the bowl off the carb, and the entire thing is covered in an orangish residue. I'm about 90% sure these jets are completely clogged. Now, I'm going to be honest, I have a very similar carb on my KTM. It's also a CR flat Cayenne. And don't get me wrong, these carbs are cool and all, but at the end of the day, they're really over-engineered, and I've had nothing but problems with the one on my KTM, and I can already tell you this one's probably going to give me tons of problems too. I'm going to try my best to get it fixed as is, but if we can't, I may have to throw another aftermarket carb on it. Alright, so I got the bowl and the jets cleaned up a little bit with some carb cleaner and got it reassembled. Now, I'm going to go ahead and make the call right now that at least before we sell this bike, I am going to have to buy a new carb for it. Even if we do find a way to jerry-rig this thing to work right now, I already know it's going to be unreliable down the road, and I don't want to do that to whoever buys this bike. I would rather give them a quality product, even if that means eating at the profits a little bit. That's what I'm willing to do. So we're definitely going to have to figure out what type of carbs we can swap onto this thing that will work, but we're going to get something figured out for that. For right now, though, after we get the electric figured out, I am just going to throw this on and see if we can get it started. And with that being said, let's try to get this figured out, and then we should be able to start cranking this bike. Alright, I stripped the two ignition wires, so hopefully we should be able to bypass the ignition by just touching these two together. So as long as I've done this correctly, we should be able to connect the power, touch those two wires together, and the bike should start cranking. Nothing's happening. Okay, so I got a bit worried there for a second, but turns out, after looking at the wiring diagram, this bike does have a clutch switch as well that needs to be engaged. There's a little switch thing that goes in here, but that was broken, so I did the same thing I did with the ignition switch. I just cut them apart and touched them together. And then this button also needs to be pressed. Okay, so this is taped so it's always in contact. This is taped so it's always in contact. That's on, so once I press this button... Good. Alright, so our starter does work. That's a good sign. Also, while inspecting the wires, I noticed that the spark plug hole has been open the whole time, and there is no spark plug. I'm going to see if I have something that will work for right now, just so we can test the compression. If not, I'll order one. Alright, I found one that will thread in and fit in the hole and plug it up so we can test compression for right now. Alright, we got the spark plug hole patched up, and we do have some compression. Okay, so I may have killed the battery because I had it probably a higher voltage than I should have. But now the battery's sizzling and I'm only getting the relay switch making a noise. The starter isn't working anymore. Starter situation really stumped me. I had to remove the exhaust to pull the starter, but I completely pulled the starter out and it worked on the bench. I would connect the right voltage to it and it would spin, and then it wouldn't work on the bike, and then it would, and then it wouldn't. Eventually, I just hooked it directly to these, which didn't work, and then it eventually did work, and now it just fixed itself. I'm not really sure what was going on there, I'm going to be honest, but it kind of just is fixed now. But I thought, now that I have cranking, and I also bought a proper spark plug for it, by the way. I'm not using the Chinese one anymore. I went ahead and threw the carb on, just out of curiosity, and it will kind of start. Let me show you. So I have an auxiliary gas tank because the actual one that came on it has some dirt in the bottom of it, and I'm going to have to clean it out. And also, one of the throttle cables was broken, so I actually only have half of the throttle I'm supposed to, but it will still kind of fire a couple of times. It won't fully start, but let me show you. And that's really good for two reasons. Number one, it means that our spark plug and our entire ignition system is good. And number two, it means we have at least some compression and we have the ability to make power, which is really good. Okay, so I went ahead and pulled the carburetor off of the bike and got the part number off of it and started doing some research on it. And basically what I found out is that I got kind of unlucky with this bike. So if this was a 2000 DRZ 400 or DRZ 400 SM, anything other than the DRZ 400E, it would actually have a different carburetor than the one it does here. And that carburetor is only like $50, brand new. Unfortunately, because they have that electric starter there, they threw this FCR MX Cayenne slant body carb on it, and this is a high performance racing carb. And just like my KTM, they're very expensive to find parts for, and they're very expensive to replace. And I've already determined that this one is unrebuildable. And what I mean by that is, even if we get all the parts and the gaskets, there's components in here that are so rusted and corroded that I would never feel comfortable using this on a bike, and I know it would give whoever buys this bike issues down the road. So we do have to replace it. Unfortunately for me and my profit margins, the best deal I could find on a brand new one is about $260. If I was to have it rebuilt professionally or just kind of fixed, I'd probably be well over that already, so at this point, I'm just going to buy a brand new one. It sucks, but it's what has to be done. And while we're waiting for that carburetor to arrive, I think it'd be a good idea to bring this bike outside and get it pressure washed and cleaned so it's ready for the install. And here I'm just blocking off the inlet and outlet of the motor so that nothing gets inside of it. Alright, so our bike is nice and clean, and we finally got our carburetor. Here it is, nice and shiny, brand new compared to this. You can kind of see the difference now, especially in the intake, how this one's all greasy and grimy and this one's not. But before we go ahead and install it, I do want to replace this damaged throttle cable with these brand new ones that I got. So let's get that done real quick. Alright, with our broken old throttle cables out and our nice new ones in, we're ready to install our carburetor. Alright, our carburetor's in. All we should have to do now is hook up the fuel, make some very basic adjustments, and it should start right up. Also, I want to apologize for the lighting today. It's kind of scuffy looking on camera. That's because it's really hot and the sun is just beaming through that window. I can't really help it because it's the only good source of lighting I have other than these. Alright, so our throttle cables are hooked up. We have fuel to the carburetor. We have power to the battery. It should start right now. Also, the smart thing to do would be to put the exhaust that I took off back on it so it's muffled. But I'm not a very smart person, so we're going to go ahead and just leave it off, because I don't really care right now. We may or may not need some assistance from our good friend Carb Cleaner. I guess we're going to see. I'm going to put a little bit of Carb Cleaner in it and just see what happens. Come on. Come on. I just remembered I had the throttle all the way up to help relieve tension, but yeah, it shouldn't have made a difference. Okay, that was really loud. It will not, it'll run, it like will run for a second, and the second I give it any type of throttle manipulation, it wants to die. Okay, so after a lot of trial and error and it's still not running right, I figured out that I don't know what these hoses do, but if they're not connected, it will not run right. There's one, they come into this box and come out here. I have no idea what they do. One goes into the head and one goes into the bottom, but either way. With that being said, I think I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. This video is just meant to be kind of an overview of the bike, figuring out what's wrong with it and what it's going to need, and most importantly, getting it running, which we did. In the next video, I'm going to be putting on the parts that I ordered for it, cleaning the parts that are already on it, polishing the plastics, polishing the wheels, getting the exhaust and the skid plate probably polished, and getting the engine tuned up to run perfectly. So, thank you guys for watching, I appreciate it, and if you guys have any recommendations for the next video, or any questions or comments, please let me know. And I'll see you guys in the next one.